Hi everyone, welcome to SBS 304 Research Methodology. This is our second lecture of the semester, and today we're going to talk about research ethics. If you're following along in your book, we're in Boyle et al. Chapter 3, Research Ethics. So I want to start by addressing some of the questions that came up on the discussion forums. Main questions that occurred were about correlation, causation, mediation, and moderation. So I want to take a few minutes to just go back over those concepts and add in some nuance that I might have brushed over the first time. So correlation simply means that two or more variables vary together. Two or more concepts are associated with each other. And we generally talk about the direction in which those two concepts or variables are related. Meaning, when we say that a correlation is positive or direct, we mean that as one variable increases, the other variable also increases. So here I've used the example of social isolation and depression. So it makes sense that those two ideas would be related. And indeed they are. And as social isolation increases, depression also increases. Here we can think of social isolation as an X and a Y, where an X is a predictor and a Y is an outcome. But realistically, with correlation, depression could be the predictor and social isolation could be the outcome. If you're very depressed, you might not want to go out or interact with people very much and might become more socially isolated. All we know from a correlation is that as one of these variables increases, the other variable also increases. We can also think of variables as being inversely or negatively correlated, meaning as one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. So we can here imagine something like social support instead of social isolation and depression. So as we feel more socially supported, we may experience less depression. As social support goes up, depression goes down. And that's a negative or inverse correlation. Note that positive and negative just relate to the direction that Y varies according to X. It doesn't have anything to do with the strength of the correlation. So we may tend to think that a positive correlation would be a strong correlation and a negative correlation would be a weak correlation. But that's not true. Variables can be strongly negatively correlated or weakly positively correlated. Those concepts are independent. When we think about causation, that's a higher standard than correlation. Correlation just means that two variables are associated with each other. As one goes up, the other goes up. But with causation, we're actually trying to say that one variable causes changes in the other variable. And we can only do this with longitudinal data. Remember that that's data that are collected over multiple points in time on the same subjects. So if I evaluated 13 people, parents income at age 6, and then I re-interviewed those people every 3 years for the next 25 years, I would have a lot of longitudinal data, even though it's only on a few people. So if I have longitudinal data, I can understand things like how parents' income when a child is 6 might impact educational attainment when that child grows up and is 25 years old. I can only do this if I have information on the same person when they're 6 years old and when they're 25 years old. I couldn't just measure parents' education for 56-year-olds and then educational attainment of 50 different unrelated 25-year-olds and say, well, clearly income at age 6 has something to do with educational attainment at age 25. I can't know that because I'm not looking at the same people over time. With causal relationships, it's a lot more important which is the predictor and which is the outcome. We can also call these independent and dependent variables. Notice on the left, I have parents' income at age 6, and I've determined that it's the independent or predictor variable. The reason I consider parents' income at age 6 to be the predictor is for two reasons. First of all, it happens first in time. So parents' income at age 6 happens before educational attainment at 25, and it has the potential to influence influence the outcome variable. So how much money your parents make when you're 6 is likely to determine what kind of educational opportunities you get throughout your life, and could therefore impact your educational attainment by the time you're 25. So the dependent variable, by contrast, happens later in time. You're 25 after you're 6, and doesn't have the potential to influence other variables unless you have a time machine. So this is a causal model where we think that someone's parents' income at age 6 actually affects how much education they have by the time they're 25. Next, we talked about mediation. And mediation is the idea that a linking variable comes between two variables that are associated and explains part of the relationship. So this is a little more complicated idea. So I've tried to illustrate it here. Imagine a study on child activity and fitness levels. Childhood obesity is a growing problem in our country. Most children are overweight or obese. And so we might be interested in learning what variables predict a healthy body weight. So we can know, for example, that how much time children spend outside is associated with lower body weight. Well, intuitively that makes sense because we fill in the gaps. What are children doing when they're outside? They're playing. They're running around playing. I don't know if you know children, but the ones I know, when they're outside, they're running around like crazy. So the linking variable that we intuitively understand is exercise. Now note that the association we're looking at between outside time and body weight is a negative association. As outside time goes up, body weight goes down. And this is altogether possible with a mediation analysis. We usually think of mediation happening between positive relationships, but it doesn't have to be that way. This was one of the questions I got, and I thought it was really astute that someone noticed that I used a positive association as an example. We can see it with positive or direct associations. Notice that you could argue the inverse. As screen time goes down, body weight goes down. Now, even though we're talking about variables going down, we're still talking about a positive association because we're talking about two variables that vary in the same way. As one goes down, the other goes down. As one goes up, the other goes up. So we might think that exercise, again, is the key here. As screen time goes down, children spending less time in front of screens are likely to be playing outside and exercising more. So screen time goes down, body weight goes down. But once again, exercise is key. If you take the screen away from a child but give her a book, it doesn't matter how little time she's spending watching television or playing video games. She's still not exercising, and her body weight will be unlikely to vary. Next, we talk about moderation. Moderation is a different concept from mediation, and it can be a little confusing to understand. It essentially means that we're looking at a main relationship between two variables, a predictor and an outcome. For example, IQ and grades. We might think that students with higher IQs will have higher grades. This makes sense. But not all people with IQs at the same level will have identical grades. There are other factors that might affect the relationship between IQ and grades that might make that relationship stronger or weaker. So, for example, children with high IQs who are very creative might have even higher grades than students with high IQs who are less creative. So one way to illustrate this is to think about creativity boosting the relationship between IQ and grades. You can also think of this, instead of the word moderation, some people use the word modification. It modifies the relationship. It alters the strength of the relationship. So instead of explaining the relationship, it actually strengthens it. So here creativity is a moderating variable that strengthens the relationship between IQ and grades. We can also think of moderation relationships where the moderator or modifier variable weakens the relationship. So for example, children with high IQs who are bullied heavily might have lower grades than children with high IQs who are not bullied. Bullying can be thought of as a moderator or modifier that is weakening the relationship between IQ and grades. So this is an understanding of moderation. It can also be a positive or a negative main effect. So here I've used a positive main effect, IQ and grades, but I could use a negative main effect too. For example, anxiety and grades, right? I could use modifiers to strengthen or weaken a positive or a negative relationship, in other words. Okay, next I want to talk about today's topic, which is research ethics. When we think of research ethics, what we mean is the moral rights and wrongs of doing social science or human subjects research. There are ethics to research that doesn't involve human subjects. So I could do wrong things with research that doesn't involve working with human beings. But today we're going to talk about ethics as it relates to human subjects. That is, when we do research and we survey, interview, or observe other human beings. So we're going to talk about three main things. We're going to talk about the common rule of research ethics. This is kind of the gold standard for how we understand research ethics to be organized and communicated. We're also going to talk about institutional review boards, the institutions that hold up research ethics. We're going to talk about some additional considerations, like vulnerable populations, using deception in research, and managing conflicts of interest. So the common rule of research ethics comes out of the Nuremberg trials. It comes to us from the aftermath of World War II. What I'm about to say might be upsetting for some people. So I want you to know that it's not going to just be a boring lecture. We're going to talk about some of the horrible things that happened to people in World War II. Not in especially graphic terms, but it could still be concerning for some people. So during World War II, the Nazis, especially Hermann Goering and Joseph Mendel, conducted a series of horrible experiments on incarcerated and interned human beings. So concentration camp victims, basically. Prisoners were subjected to horrible studies, experiments, tortures, in an attempt to learn what the human body could withstand. It was also Mendel's twin experiments were also the basis for a lot of what we understand about modern genetics. So it's easy to get on our high horse and talk about some of the horrible things that were done that sound crazy to us. For example, people were given, people were put in icy cold water with no clothes on until to see what cold temperatures human bodies could withstand and what kind of tissue damage would result. But twin studies were also done, and studies on pregnant women were done that are the basis for a lot of what we understand about modern obstetrics and modern genetics and heritability. So it's really easy to say, well, the experiments they did were atrocious and crazy. But it's important to be intellectually humble and honest with ourselves and say a lot of things that we know today came out of these experiments, horrible as and unethical as they were. So this brings up a question that we have to grapple with as researchers. Is it ever okay to do wrong, harmful things to human beings if what we're going to learn has the potential to be really beneficial? And this was part of the war criminals defense when the International Military Court tried these men, these Nazis. A lot of them said, you know, what we learned was invaluable. What we learned was really important, and what we learned has applications that could help a lot of people. And the International Military Court and all the researchers around the world who are watching these proceedings collectively agreed it doesn't matter. It's not okay to torture and mutilate and violate human beings in order to learn something, no matter how important. And so this gives us the principles that we now refer to as the common rule of research ethics. The common rule has three main parts, each with many implications that we're going to talk through now. The first kind of leg of the common rule is the idea of respect for persons, that when conducting human subjects research, we have to consider and proceed in a way that respects human beings. And this implies certain rights that research subjects have. One is the right to be represented in research. The idea we're going to deal with the most directly in this course is the idea of the right to give informed consent. Implied in that is the right to withdraw consent. So a person essentially has the right to change her mind. So a person also has the right to privacy. That is, they have the right to have their identity protected and not to be publicly embarrassed by participating in research. And this all falls under the broad category of respect for persons. Basically, respect for the individual's autonomy and the individual's right to make choices for themselves. So thinking about respect for persons, biased research can cause harm to individuals and communities. And biases in research can reflect and reinforce historical inequalities. From a purely self-interested standpoint, biases in research also produce bad science. So when we do research that doesn't include different kinds of people and that leaves out many perspectives, we don't know what we think we know. We only know these things about a particular group, but not about everybody. So what can we do when representation is burdensome? What I mean by that, I don't mean when it's hard for us as researchers to achieve, but a question that we often have to grapple with as researchers is, for some people, it's a real difficulty or a real challenge to participate in research. So what do we do when asking someone to participate in research may be burdening for that person? And what about groups and communities? So when we think of research on human subjects, we most often think of individuals. But what about groups and communities? Do we need to consider that certain communities have the right to be represented in research? For example, I research poverty and inequality, and especially as it relates to stress, and especially as it relates to mental health. So when we look at communities in poverty, we most often look at urban communities. What about rural communities, though? They have really different stressors on average. They have poverty in high levels, but they don't have the same kind of resources for dealing with poverty. And they don't have the same resources to cope with poverty. So they don't have mental health resources in the way a lot of cities do. So when we consider inclusion and representation, do we need to consider groups and communities as well as individual demographics? When we think about informed consent, we have to think about providing complete information about the study. We also have to consider a person's ability to give consent. So we have to consider whether the person we're talking to has the ability to understand the concept of consent. Did they know, in effect, what we're asking of them? Do they know that they have the right to say no? Are they able to understand? So we most often have to think about this when we're considering people who are children, people who are very old and may have cognitive decline, or people who may have intellectual disabilities. Um, but we also have to consider people who may be conditioned to respond to authority in a particular way, and people who are um, in people who have a lot less power than we have as researchers. Uh, so we have to consider that some people may not have the ability to understand the concept of consent. We also have to make sure that the people we're asking for consent have the freedom to withhold consent. So when we talk about vulnerable populations, we're mostly going to be talking about people who can't understand and people who aren't free to withhold consent. Um, so by freedom to withhold consent, what I mean is, um, if I approach someone who is in dire straits, who's desperate, and I say, "Hey, would you like to participate in this research?" Um, would it doesn't pay anything, and I can't do anything for you necessarily, but I'm representing a public services agency. Would you consider participating in research? Now, ostensibly, this person is perfectly free to tell me to go away, right? This person has every right to just say, no, thank you. I don't want to. Please leave me alone. However, if I represent a social services agency and this person is desperate for social services, they might feel that by participating in my research, I'll be able to help them in some way. At what point could that become manipulative? There are also people who are literally not free to withhold consent. Um, for example, persons who are incarcerated may feel that if a guard or a correctional officer or a law enforcement officer asks them if they want to participate in research, that the only correct answer is yes, because of the power dynamic at play. We also have to consider whether we've given an appropriate presentation of the information that we're asking people to consider. So if I tell you about my academic study and ask you to consent to participate, but you can't read, then what I've just told you may not be, or given you may not be appropriate for you to understand and give consent. It might be a lot more appropriate to give you a graphic representation, or to talk you through consent verbally. We also have a responsibility to emphasize the freedom to withhold or withdraw consent. And we have the responsibility to provide appropriate incentives. So if I have something that somebody needs and I have the power to give it to them as an incentive for research participation, I could potentially manipulate them into participating in research they really don't want to participate in. And we have to hold ourselves to a standard of, are we manipulating people? Are we unfairly inducing people? So, if I'm doing research on people who are experiencing homelessness, and I say the research incentive is $100, that's a lot of money if you're experiencing homelessness. That's enough to get a hotel room for the night, maybe for a couple of nights, depending on the hotel. That's enough to eat for a long time. That's enough to get some safety, right? That might be enough to get a bus ticket to a different city where you have family. That's a huge incentive if you're homeless. If I were doing the same research on investment bankers and I offered $100 as an incentive, I might not get any takers. So the same incentive can be appropriate or inappropriate depending on my population. So I'd like you to do the following learning activity. I'd like you to follow the link in the slide. Remember that the PowerPoint slides are posted in Moodle. I'd like you to follow the link on this slide and complete a 3-question form. It asks you questions about research and incentives. Then I'd like you to take a few moments to reflect on your answers. When we consider respect for persons, we also have to consider the right to privacy. That is, the right to have their participation in research and their identifying information kept private. Now, there are a couple of different standards of privacy. One is confidentiality. Confidentiality means to keep something secret. So if something is confidential, it's between you and the subject or the participant. So you will know who they are and what they've said and maybe some identifying information about them, but you really, really, really super promise to keep it to yourself. Anonymity is a higher standard that we sometimes use in research, especially when the subject we're researching is really sensitive. Anonymity is the standard of no identifying information is collected at all. So we collect people's answers and we ask them to be truthful with us, but we don't collect their names, their addresses, their phone numbers, or anything that could be used to trace their answers back to them. There are some problems logistically with anonymity, which is if I don't collect identifying information, how do I know the same person isn't responding to the research multiple times? How do I know that that person really fits into my research population and doesn't just want the incentive? But it can be essential to getting participants to give consent if what I'm researching could be potentially embarrassing or dangerous for them. Threats to privacy. What would keep you from keeping someone's information private? The answers tend to be institutional. So your information, your research notes, your research records, very rarely could be used as evidence against someone in a legal proceeding. This has happened before. It's pretty uncommon. But researchers have had their records subpoenaed by a court or by a government agency and been required under penalty of contempt to turn over the names and information of their participants. This was true of one researcher who's doing research on gang activity. And another example would be, people doing research on people with deviant or illegal sexual behaviors. Those records can be subpoenaed, and there are currently researchers sitting in jail because they burned their records or shredded their records or deleted their records and refused to turn them over. We have to take seriously the right of persons to privacy. There's often a tension between privacy and representation. So, in research on marginalized groups or groups with a clear agenda, it's often in that group's interest to be represented. It's often in that group's interest to claim their answers and to say, I don't want you to say, one participant said, I want you to say Stephanie said, right? I want you to name my experience and use my name. So there's often a tension between people not wanting to remain confidential or anonymous and wanting to claim their answers, and the rights of marginalized or underrepresented groups to be represented. So an example might be doing research on an indigenous tribe or an indigenous nation. that group may want their struggle to be well documented. That may be the interest they have in participating in the research, is our story will get out there. The same is true for activist organizations. They often want research to profile them particularly. So you have to consider whether that fits with your research agenda, but also whether that compromises the privacy of people who may want their data to remain private. We also have to think about when privacy is not enough. So there are certain cases where just by doing research on a group, you could accidentally reveal the identities of people in that group. The group is small enough, the figures in that group are well known enough that anything they say could be identifying, and that they could suffer repercussions. So if I said I was participating in research on gang activity in Philadelphia, and I identified it that way, and I talked to gang members in Philadelphia, it's possible that anybody seen with me would immediately be suspected of gang activity, right? And that's a problem that a well-known public sociologist actually encountered. Venkatesh did research on gang members, and so anyone the police saw with him, they assumed were gang members and were subject to arrest and harassment. So sometimes even taking normal steps to assure confidentiality isn't enough. And we really have to ask, is it safe for my participants for me to do this research at all? Is it at all safe for me to even include them? Should I ask a different question and save this research for another time? The second standard that we encounter in the common rule is the standard of beneficence. So beneficence is the idea that it literally means harmlessness. Beneficence means harmlessness. And it's the standard that research should do no physical, mental, or social harm to research subjects. Now, physical and mental harm is pretty obvious. We shouldn't shame people. We shouldn't torture people. We shouldn't threaten people. We shouldn't put people in danger. But what about social harm? So social harm means we shouldn't reveal things about people or say things about a group that are going to subject them to kind of social exclusion, social isolation, interpersonal problems. Feminist researchers and feminist methodologists have an additional standard here. So feminism is generally thought of as a gender issue, but in social science, feminist research methods are research methods that seek to lessen the differentials of power. So ethics are practices that seek to equalize power among persons and groups. So the feminist ethic here is to avoid harm to not just to individuals, but to groups and communities. So we shouldn't just make sure we're not identifying a single person in a way that could harm them. We should be careful of whether we're painting a fair picture of a group or a community. Imagine if I went to a community and did research on them, and I didn't identify any individuals, but then I went off and said, this community is really trash. This community is a really bad community, and I wouldn't live here, and, I wouldn't want to raise my kids here. You could really hurt that community. And imagine if you are studying a marginalized group like trans women, who, are already kind of belittled and harmed by society. And you learn some things about the group of trans women you're interviewing that are not very flattering. Maybe some of the people you're interviewing are doing things that are pretty scandalous that aren't necessarily relevant to your research and that aren't necessarily being done because they're trans women. Um, you have a responsibility to carefully consider whether that information is necessary to communicating your research findings and what harm you might bring to a group of people by revealing that information. Assuming, of course, this does not extend to situations where somebody is in danger or someone is being harmed. So, if you are doing research on former sex offenders or people in the sex offender registry, and you found out that certain of your participants were engaged in harmful behaviors, with victims, um, your responsibilities to not embarrass them would be secondary to your responsibility to keep people safe. So, this doesn't mean to say that feminist ethics imply that you should never tell on anybody ever because you might embarrass them. Merely, you should consider whether you're going to harm a group or a community by revealing negative information about them, especially if it's not relevant to your research question. We also have a responsibility to avoid intellectually exploiting people. What this means for feminist researchers is that often researchers will go into under-resourced or less powerful communities and groups, collect enough information to tell a really interesting story, write a book about those people's experiences, never give the people they worked with any credit, and never share any of the kind of positive outcomes from that research. So if we go into a community and we take their knowledge and we take their information and we take their stories, and then we individually profit off of it, but don't do anything for those people, are we doing ethical research or are we being kind of culture vultures? So that's something we have to think about as researchers. The third principle of the common rule of research ethics is the idea of justice. And this is just the idea that risks and benefits of research should be balanced. So the risks to participants should be minimized. We should try to make sure participants undertake as little risk as possible. Benefits to participants should be maximized. And participants should be carefully informed of potential risks and potential benefits. So in an informed consent document, you'll typically see a section called risks and benefits, where research participants are told explicitly, these are the risks we foresee happening if you undertake this research. And here are the ways you could directly benefit. So the feminist ethic of risk and benefit or justice is the idea that risks and benefits should be discussed and decided upon collectively. So participants or a group of potential participants should be interviewed before research is undertaken and should help you understand what risks the research could pose. So maybe I don't understand as an outsider why my research could be risky to a particular group of people. Maybe I just lack an understanding of that scenario that would help me understand why my research was risky. And maybe if I knew, I wouldn't undertake that research, or I would do it very differently. So risks and benefits should be discussed and decided upon collectively. I shouldn't get to decide, these are the risks I think are important and worth taking. And these are the benefits I think would be sufficient. Participants should have a voice in that. And research agendas should be set collectively as well. So I can have my question, but what's important to know should be important or should be of value to the community as well. So if I'm doing research with an organization, for example, what I would do is meet with a leader of that organization and say, hey, I want to do research on this group. Um, Here are my questions. What would you like me to ask? What would you like to know? What can I do that would be a benefit to you while I'm doing this research? And do you think that what I'm doing is an okay idea? And if you don't, how do I need to change it to make it a safe idea? Um, and ideally, benefits should accrue to participants and researchers equally. So I shouldn't just come in, collect the knowledge, and leave with it and never go back. I should do something that will benefit the people I'm working with. A pioneer of this kind of research was named Jane Addams, Addams with two D's. And she was at the University of Chicago. And Jane Addams worked in a settlement house with immigrants to the United States and to Chicago particularly. She ran a settlement house, which was basically an apartment block where new immigrants could move in for free or very low rent and participate in programs to help them adapt to American culture. They could learn English, but they could also learn trades and skills from each other. They participated in skill shares. They could cook and share expenses collectively. Their children were given education collectively. So it was like a social services clearinghouse for recent immigrants. And in addition to running this institution called the Hull House, uh, Jane Addams did a number of sociological research projects with the residents of Hull House as research subjects. She did this in ways that were used for fundraising, for grant getting, and for policy advocacy to benefit recent immigrants. So the benefits of her research accrued both to her and to her participants. And this is kind of a standard of feminist research. Next, I want to talk about what institutional review boards are. This is a short discussion, but it's something you should be aware of. Almost every institution that conducts research, including BSc, has an institutional review board. Institutional review boards are tasked with holding researchers accountable for upholding research ethics. Ideally, an institutional review board should be multidisciplinary. That is, there should be researchers on the institutional review board from a variety of disciplines, including the humanities, the arts, social sciences, natural sciences, math, etc. They should also review and approve or disapprove of all proposed research taking place in the institution. So any research I want to do that includes human subjects, even if I'm analyzing data that have already been collected, I write up a proposal and send it to the institutional review board. And it's their job to ensure that the common rule and other standards of research ethics are upheld. Their job is not to determine whether my research has merit or whether my research is good, just whether I'm likely to hurt anybody. So here, I've included a list of the people who are on the institutional review board here at BSc. And please notice that in addition to 4 faculty, it includes Ryan Lillard, who's a community representative. So our institutional review board actually includes a person from the community at large around the college who can look at our research and say, you know, as a non-academic, I see the following problems with this research. Or, yeah, I think this research is appropriate for our community. It also includes Joe Chandler, who's he's in charge of grant getting for BSc, and Candy Hale, who is the assistant to the provost. So she kind of works with the provost to supervise the faculty. So one of the things that the Institutional Review Board does is to protect vulnerable populations. Vulnerable populations are populations who are deprived of freedom to make decisions, or include populations who are deprived of freedom to make decisions. So we already talked about the idea of incarcerated persons or other institutionalized persons. For example, patients in a hospital. We also might think about, from a feminist standpoint, what about power differentials? So it's not necessarily obvious that a student in one of my classes wouldn't be free to say no, right? You're an adult, you're not incarcerated, you're not locked up, but I'm your professor. If I ask you, hey, would you mind participating in this research that I want you to participate in? I'd really appreciate it. I'm in so much power over you in this instance that you might think, oh, wow, I better not say no. Like, I mean, I'm not that powerful, but let's say, for example, that President Coleman asked you to participate in some research. You might think, wow, that person has a lot of power over me. I probably better do what he wants, right? Certainly, if President Coleman asked me to participate in research, I would feel compelled to say yes because he's my boss's boss's boss, right? So I would definitely feel some compulsion to say yes, even if I really wanted to say no. Other vulnerable populations include people who may lack the ability to make informed decisions, and this can include children and adults with intellectual disabilities, including very old adults who may have cognitive decline. Although certainly some older adults are very capable of making good decisions. So we don't count on children to give informed consent about participating in research. If children are going to participate in research, we certainly ask for their consent, but that's not sufficient. We also have to ask for their parent or guardian's consent, in the same way we would do if the child wanted to sign a legal contract or have a medical treatment. We require their parents' consent as well. And of course, we call it child assent, meaning the child agrees. And if the child doesn't give assent, then they shouldn't participate. So basically, a child saying no is enough for us to exclude them from research, but a child saying yes isn't sufficient for us to include them. The same thing applies to adults with intellectual disabilities. But we also have to consider adults who may be intellectually or neurologically typical, but who may have lesser ability to understand or make good informed choices in a particular instance. So, for example, it would be unethical for me to go to a fraternity party and ask a bunch of drunk people if I could interview them for research, because in their current frame of mind, they're not able to make a good decision. We wouldn't trust them to drive a car or sign a contract or get married in that condition, so we don't trust them to agree to participate in research either. We also consider populations who may be especially vulnerable to harm. So just like incentives don't affect everybody in the same way, risks don't affect everybody in the same way. So we generally don't ask people who are very sick, people who are pregnant, or occasionally very marginalized groups or communities. We generally don't ask those people to participate in research because we think that risks that would be acceptable for most people to undertake may become unacceptable for those people. Now, in social science research, it's a lot less obvious who's especially vulnerable to harm, since the main kind of risk people undertake from participating in social science research is emotional stress or social embarrassment. we may ask from time to time questions that are distressing for people to think about, and we may ask questions that are potentially embarrassing if the information gets out. So it's not necessarily clear why sick people or pregnant women would be especially at risk for, being stressed out or being embarrassed. But those are still considered vulnerable populations by most institutional review boards. So, in addition to considering vulnerable populations and upholding the common rule, there's some other things we really need to think about when we're doing research, places where we could easily go wrong in conducting our research. For example, is it ever okay to use deception in our research? Bearing in mind that sometimes research can't be done without some use of deception. The reason might be social desirability, meaning I might give answers that aren't true because I think they're the right answer, or because, don't underestimate this effect. Participants, when they agree to participate in your research, generally do it out of a willingness to help you. It's a very pro-social behavior. Participants will agree to participate in your research because they want to help a nice college student with their work. And they might try to give answers that they think will help you. If they think the research is for a particular purpose, then they might try to support that goal with the answers that they give. I got very concerned, as an example, when I was a college student and I took a psychology experiment for my friend Bria's project. And it had to do with depression and listening. So I was to take a scale of depression, like a survey to determine how depressed I was. Then I was supposed to participate in some listening exercises. And then I was supposed to take the test again. Well, I knew what was supposed to happen. I was supposed to, be depressed, and then I was supposed to get better. And so I had a lot of temptation the second time I took the test to change my answers, to try to remember, what did I put the first time? Well, let's make it a little better this time, right? Because I wanted Bria's research to work out. I wanted her to do a good job and get a good grade. So I thought, I'll just help prove her point a little bit. But as a researcher myself, I understood that that impulse was not ethical. And I understood that Bria would not want me to do that. So I didn't do it. But it was very tempting. There's also the example of the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is the idea that just knowing that something is being studied will change your response. So if, for example, I tell you not to think about a polar bear, you immediately picture a polar bear in your mind and think about a polar bear. You can't help it. I just said it, and now you're thinking about polar bears instead of research ethics. Shame on you. Don't think about polar bears, think about research ethics. But just by saying polar bear, I primed you to think about them. Similarly, if I ask you to think about, if I tell you I'm doing a study on masculinity, you immediately start thinking about, oh, well, what is masculinity? Am I masculine? How masculine am I? Right? You immediately start thinking about masculinity, and that's likely to shape your answers. So, while upholding respect for persons and the right of people to give informed consent, is it ever okay to use deception? Most sociologists say yes, sometimes. Political scientists, I really am not as versed in the standards of using deception in research. But within sociology and psychology, it's generally considered okay to use some deception as long as you're not misleading them about the risks they'll be undertaking or misleading them about the kind of questions they'll be answering or the kinds of things they'll be doing. So here's an example of an experiment that was done using some deception. A group of seminary students, that is, students of Christian theology and ministry, were told that they would be giving a sermon on the story of the Good Samaritan. For those of you who don't know, the Good Samaritan was a social outcast who, despite being socially persecuted, went out of his way to tend to the wounds of an injured person from the group who persecuted his people. And so these seminary students were told that they would be they would be doing an activity, and then they would travel to the next building over and deliver a sermon on the Good Samaritan. So they spent their time doing activities related to the story of the Good Samaritan, and then on their way to the next building, they encountered a person lying next to the sidewalk who appeared injured. And the experiment was whether they would stop to help the person as the protagonist in the story had done. And it turns out that they did, unless they were told they were running late. So it turns out that the seminary students most of the time stopped to help the injured person, unless they were told, by the way, you were supposed to be at the chapel 5 minutes ago, you're already late, hurry. It turns out that if they thought they were late, they didn't stop to help most of the time. A few people said, well, forget the sermon, I've got to help this person. But a lot of people didn't. So they weren't lied to about what they would be doing. They were still prepping a sermon and delivering a sermon on the Good Samaritan, but they weren't told they would be given the opportunity to help somebody along the way. So were they exposed to a risk they otherwise wouldn't have been exposed to? Maybe. Maybe they feel bad about themselves if they didn't stop to help. I don't know. But it was determined that this was an acceptable thing to do. It's considered especially acceptable to use some deception in research, assuming other ethical standards are met, if you debrief afterward. That is, if you do research that includes any element of deception, no matter how minor, you're expected to let participants know at the end of their participation what the research question really was and what they were actually supposed to be, doing, what was really under study. So if you explain to them afterward, it's considered more acceptable. So a more contemporary question, a question that we're increasingly engaging as social science scholars, is how quality affects ethics. Whether the quality of your research is an ethical consideration. In other words, is it ethical to engage human subjects in useless research? Maybe your research isn't harmful. Maybe it's not especially intrusive or embarrassing. Maybe it just sucks. Maybe your research is just dumb. If your research is dumb, if it's badly thought out, and you don't actually stand to learn or gain anything from it, and you're unlikely to, your research is unlikely to lead to change that could help anybody, is it okay to include human subjects in your research? Increasingly, we're deciding, no, there has to be some minimum standard of quality before we agree to let human subjects participate. So increasingly, institutional review boards are checking for things like, is there a clear research question? Is the research question answerable? Are the dependent and independent variables measured well? Is there a reason based on the literature to think that this research question is answerable or is important? What applications do you foresee for your research? So increasingly, institutional review boards are wanting to see some justification that your research will actually not suck. But who decides whether research is useful? And useful for what and for whom? So essentially, even if academics agree that the research is useful, is that enough? Or do we have a duty, a moral duty, to make sure that our research will be useful for the population we're studying? And is feasibility an ethical concern? Is it ethical to engage human subjects in research that we can't complete or can't see through to its conclusion because of practical concerns? We run out of time. We run out of money. We graduate. We get bored and decide not to do it anymore. So is feasibility an ethical consideration? A lot of people would say yes. We need to make sure we can actually complete our research and that it's actually going to be good for something before we expose human subjects to risk, no matter how minimal. Finally, I want us to talk about conflicts of interest. This is when a researcher has connections, associations, positions, investments, etc., which would cause them to benefit from a particular outcome, effectively, or from doing the research at all. So if I am, for myself, I'm an animal rights activist. If I decide to do research on an animal rights and protection group, I have a vested interest in painting a positive picture of that group because of my connections and associations. That might not be research I should do because I have a conflict of interest. I'm a member of that group. I belong to that group, and I have strong investment, intellectual and mental investment in that group being good and doing well, right? So maybe that's not the research project for me. A researcher may also have financial incentives that would affect their ethical judgment. So if I am doing research that I think will make a neighborhood look good, but I want to invest in property in that neighborhood, I might have a strong inclination to make that neighborhood look like a better place to live than it actually is, because I want my investments to do well, right? So I could have financial obligation or financial incentives that would cause me to make less ethical judgments. And that's important to consider. The main way conflicts of interest are handled is to disclose them. So while certain conflicts of interest, when revealed to institutional review boards, are serious enough that the institutional review board will say, you can't do that research. You have a clear conflict of interest. Most of the time, if the conflict of interest is considered acceptable, we just write about it in the paper. We have a footnote that says, for disclosure, Stephanie has invested in property in the neighborhood understudy, right? So that's generally how we handle that. So I want to give you some examples of unethical research. And this will probably take us over the time limit for the class. So you're kind of free to listen to this or not. The first study I want us to think about that was clearly unethical is called the tea room trade. And I posted the article about the tea room trade to Moodle under under course readings. So in the tea room trade, a researcher named Laud Humphreys in the 1960s wanted to understand gay bathhouse culture. So bathhouses were not actually bathhouses, and there were no actual tea rooms. Tea room was a gay slang term for public bathrooms where gay men would meet up for anonymous sex. Now, this sounds salacious. Consider that at the time, gay sex was illegal. Being gay was illegal. For context, England had recently sentenced Alan Turing to chemical castration because they found out he was gay. He was a war hero responsible for cracking the Enigma code and helping to win World War II for the Allies. But he was punished in monstrous ways for being a gay person. So gay sex was very illegal, and being discovered to be gay was very risky at the time. Certainly, if you were discovered to be gay, you would be terribly socially stigmatized and outcast from society. Knowing this, Lord Humphreys designed a study where he would observe gay men having anonymous sex in park bathrooms by posing as a voyeur. That is, someone who derives sexual pleasure from watching other people have sex. He posed as a voyeur who served as a lookout and basically watched other strange men have anonymous sex in park bathrooms. Well, he decided that observing their behavior was interesting and all, but what he really needed to do was interview these men to figure out what their lives were really like. So how did he do that? He wrote down their license plate numbers. He watched them go to their cars after their encounters, and he wrote down their license plate numbers. And then he used a friend in the Department of Motor Vehicles to get a list of their license plate numbers and their home addresses. He then disguised himself so that he wouldn't be recognized as the person from the bathroom, and went to these men's homes where they lived with their families and interviewed them, often in the living room while their wives were nearby. So he was interviewing these men about being gay in spaces where if they were outed as gay, they would face terrible consequences. So this is obviously unethical. For one thing, he made no efforts to get informed consent. For another thing, he violated their privacy by tracing their license plates and going to their homes. And for another thing, he subjected them to great potential harm. He didn't get informed consent. He didn't consider the risks and benefits safely. And they benefited from this research not at all. Risk was maximized, benefit was minimized. Another study that I want us to talk about, because it's particularly egregious, is the Tuskegee syphilis study. So the Tuskegee syphilis study was a study of the syphilitic disease, which is now treatable with a single shot of penicillin, but at the time was incurable. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted infection that causes lesions on the skin, impotence, extreme pain, and neuropathy. So nerve pain, nerve damage, eventually often blindness and dementia. So syphilis is very serious and terminal. Unless you die of something else first, you'll eventually die from untreated syphilis. It can also be transmitted to sexual partners at any stage of outbreak, and it can also be passed to unborn children in utero. So the Tuskegee syphilis study, members of the Tuskegee College wanted to research syphilis and how it affected people over time. So they recruited men from the area, from rural Alabama and surrounding areas, who were almost entirely black. So this was a study on black men who who knew they had syphilis and didn't have any money to basically provide for their medical care and provide for their final expenses. So the incentive that was offered for participation was free medical care for as long as they lived, and free funeral. The researchers would pay for the person's funeral to save money for these men's families. The consent rate was very high. Most people who had terminal syphilis agreed. This is bad enough because, of course, representation is a problem. Representation in this case, they were going specifically to poor black men who had very few alternatives when asked to do something by white researchers. So the power dynamics were at play. They also were giving an incentive that was something these people could not otherwise have accessed and desperately needed. So they're giving an incentive that would have made almost anybody say yes under those circumstances. So you can already question whether this study was ever ethical at all. But here's where it gets real bad. In the 1940s, penicillin was discovered to be an efficacious treatment for syphilis. So shortly after the study kicked off in the 30s, they discovered an effective cure for syphilis. So the study was over, right? No. The researchers decided it was so important to understand how untreated syphilis would affect people that not only did they not give the men under their care penicillin to treat their syphilis, they contacted other local hospitals and doctors and said, here's a list of the people in this study. If they come to you for care, don't give them penicillin. This is horrible. They essentially, in the face of an inexpensive cure for a terminal disease, deliberately withheld it so that they could study the ravages of the disease on poor black men in the Jim Crow South. They continued this study until years later, until most of the men had died. Because they successfully kept them from getting effective medical care. So it's obvious what ethical standards this study violates. It violates all of them. It violates every possible ethical standard that I can think of. Certainly every standard or every principle of the common rule. But also violates, standards of human morality. So I want you to think about the fact that both of these instances of research violated people's rights. Both of these instances of research violated different standards to different degrees. And they were differentially egregious. So both are examples of unethical research. The tea room trade certainly had the potential to harm people in terrible ways. That should not be downplayed or minimized. If most of these men had been discovered, which to our knowledge none of them were, but if any of these men had been discovered to be gay, they would have lost their jobs, their families, and likely their freedom. They could also have been subjected to terrible violence. In the Tuskegee syphilis study, men with no power were effectively sentenced to death in the face of a simple cure for their disease, in the name of research. So when we think of what should have been done differently in each of these studies, I think it's obvious. These are basically object lessons in how never to do research. So I want you to consider these examples when you're designing your own studies. How do we make sure that our research respects our participants? That our research considers the power we have over research participants as researchers? How do we make sure that our research is beneficent? That is, that it's designed in a way that shouldn't do harm to anybody. How do we consider risks, benefits, and the justice of how those risks and benefits are distributed? Are we taking on risk, or are we just getting all the benefit for research that puts others at risk? How do we make sure we've designed research of quality that won't waste the time and resources of our participants? And how do we make sure that we're representing the proper people in our research? And that everyone with an interest in our research has the right to be represented. So these are all considerations we need to make. And looking at counterexamples can be very instructive. For one, because it can show us what not to do in particular, but also it can show us what can go horribly wrong when research is done in an unethical fashion. So please participate in the forums and let me know if you have any questions about this lecture. Looking forward, I want to talk about how to choose a research topic, how to get assistance, and how to catch up if you've fallen behind. So the first lab exercise is due a week from this Wednesday on September 16th by 5 p.m. Central Time. So if you're currently off campus and not on Central Time, please submit it by 5 p.m. Central. That is when the submission drop box will close. Only a few of you have scheduled appointments with me to talk about your topic. Everyone who has scheduled an appointment has told me that they found it helpful. Please, oh please, oh please, schedule an appointment with me to talk about your research topic if you're unsure. The sooner you let me know you need help, the more likely it is that I'll be able to help you effectively. Remember that we have an optional lab meeting on Wednesday and every Wednesday at 12:30. I will begin the meeting promptly at 12:30. If no one has joined me by 12:45, I will end the meeting. But as long as at least one or two people have joined me by 12:45, I'll conduct the meeting, record it, and post the video. If you need assistance, use the discussion forums. I read those carefully and participate in them. Email me directly. You can also schedule an appointment with me, or you can schedule an appointment with our Academic Resource Center tutor, Olivia Seckinger, who's a brilliant student and will do a great job helping you learn. I've included a link in the slide to how you can schedule an appointment with her, but her virtual office hours are Tuesdays from 1 to 4. If those times don't work for you, she's also available by appointment. So in addition to scheduling an appointment with me, you can schedule an appointment with Olivia, and she will help you. If you've gotten behind, I suggest that to catch up, you watch the video lectures and follow along in the textbook. I suggest that you review the vocabulary, so the bold terms and the subject or chapter headings, and the words that are in the little boxes, the inset boxes on the margins of the page. And email me with specific questions or schedule a meeting. So whether you email me or whether you schedule a meeting, it's best if you have specific questions ready. If you just say, hey, I'm completely lost, I don't know how to work with that. I will try my best, but you will be much better served if you read the chapters, watch the videos, and say, here are some things I didn't understand. then I'm happy to work through those with you. What if you have COVID, though? If you have COVID, this is completely different. Just let me know that you're ill, rest and take care of yourself, drink lots of water, make sure you go to the doctor if you need to. Don't worry about this course. It will be here when you get over COVID. And email me when you feel better so we can get you back on track. So if you have COVID and you are behind and you can't catch up right now because you're really sick, please chill out. I'm going to help you. Do not worry. That is it for me today. Please make sure you're caught up through reading chapter 3. And please make sure to participate in the discussion forums so you can get your participation grade. And I hope to see you tomorrow in the optional lab meeting. Thank you and have a great day.